The radio said Murin's name in Dex's voice, and Dex had been dead for 11 days. Thani Ashkani heard it from inside the survival pod, curled around the heating coil with her knees pulled to her chest, and for 3 full seconds she stopped breathing. The voice came through the salvage frequency, cracked, salt-weathered by static, the way Dex's voice always sounded after a long EVA, slightly roughened at the edges from breathing recycled air too long. It said, "Murin, you need to pull the secondary cable first. Don't be an idiot about it." Then it said nothing else. Thani had not made a sound in 4 days. She made one now. The Veth-Oru recovery vessel had been decelerating toward her for 6 hours. She knew this because the pod's collision alarm had noted it, classifying the incoming mass as a vessel of unknown registry moving at a velocity inconsistent with debris. She had not thought to be frightened of it. She had not thought to be frightened of anything anymore. The docking arm found her pod the way a tide finds a rock, patiently, without particular urgency, with an efficiency that had nothing theatrical about it. The hull interfaced. Pressure equalized. A circular aperture irised open and let in a smell like copper and warm ethanol and something biological underneath, something that reminded her distantly of kelp at low tide. The Veth-Oru who entered was approximately the length of a human being but oriented differently, not vertically but along a plane, a flattened ovoid body supported on 6 articulated limbs, the upper 4 of which ended in clusters of fine manipulators. Its surface was not skin as Thani understood the word. It was membrane, translucent at the margins, and beneath the membrane something moved. Light, or the biological equivalent of light, pulsing in slow sequences of amber and blue. It had no face she could identify. It had an anterior end which turned toward her, and whatever sensory apparatus lived there, olfactory, chemical, electromagnetic, assessed her in a way she felt as pressure rather than sight. She had been trained for first contact. She had attended 6 seminars on xenocultural protocol. She had a laminated card somewhere in her suit that outlined first contact procedures in 4 languages, including gestures appropriate for species without bilateral symmetry. She sat on the floor of the pod and said, in a voice she barely recognized as hers, "Dex is dead. They're all dead. There are 4 of them in the wreckage of the Crestfall asterisk. Please don't." She stopped. She didn't know what she was asking. The alien pulsed amber-blue amber. It did not come closer. It observed her with the careful attention of something accustomed to cataloging things that were new. SCIVRAC 4 was recording. This was always SCIVRAC 4's first response to novel data. Record it, index it, store it in the chemical lattice memory that the Veth-Oru maintained not in individual minds but collectively, in the trace compounds secreted by every member of a recovery crew and absorbed by every other. When SCIVRAC 4 encountered something that did not fit an existing category, and the human, alone in this small vessel, weeping without apparent mechanism, represented several simultaneous failures of categorization, the correct response was intensive documentation. The human's distress signals were chemical as well as acoustic. Cortisol, adrenaline metabolites, the particular saline composition of lacrimal fluid. SCIVRAC 4 had records of 4 other human specimens, encountered at trade stations, observed in controlled settings. None of them had produced this specific chemical signature. The closest analog in Veth-Oru records was the pheromone burst of a reproductive failure event, the chemical broadcast a Veth-Oru mother emitted when a larval cluster failed to develop. But that was an automatic biological response, not a sustained behavioral one. This human had been producing these compounds for days, according to the pod's environmental logs. Sustained, intentional, the body recreating its distress rather than metabolizing it. SCIVRAC 4 filed a preliminary note in the collective memory. Human physiological response to crew loss does not terminate. Mechanism unclear. Continue observation. Thani let herself be moved through the ship. She noted its biology in the fractured way of someone who is still functioning, but only just. The walls were grown, not built, a pale fibrous material that gave slightly under pressure and smelled of that persistent copper kelp. Bioluminescent channels ran along the ceiling. The floors were tacky underfoot, providing grip the way a sea creature's secretion might, and she understood without being told that this ship was as much organism as machine. They put her in a room with a sleeping surface and a water dispenser, and what she took to be food, a gray paste that tasted of nothing in particular but left her less hollow than before. She ate it mechanically, cross-legged on the sleeping surface, and stared at the wall, and tried not to listen for voices. She listened for voices. There was nothing. The ship breathed around her, an actual respiratory sound, the vessel cycling atmosphere through what were apparently lungs of a kind, and in that quiet she arranged her crew in her mind, the way she had been arranging them for 11 days. Dex in engineering, always louder than necessary, always right about the secondary cable. Lane in navigation, who had brought coffee to Thani's console every morning without being asked and never made it into a thing. Captain Voren, who had given final coordinates to rescue ships that took 4 days too long to respond, whose voice had been the last human voice she'd heard before the crestfall broke apart, and whose voice she had just heard again through a dead radio on a salvage frequency. She put her back to the wall and drew her knees up and held them, and waited for morning, though there was no morning here, and no one to notice if she never moved again. In the collective memory of the recovery crew, HFY-4's observation accumulated new notes through the cycle. The human does not sleep. The human maintains a physical posture consistent with vigilance, though no threat is present. The human's chemical distress signature has not diminished. It is possible the human is ill. It is possible this is the human's normal state. It is not possible to determine which without further data. Further data required. The voices came from the communication array. Thani had been aboard the Veth-Oru vessel for 31 hours when she heard the first one. She was in the corridor outside her room. She'd been making wider and wider circuits of the ship, partly because remaining still had become physically intolerable, and partly because she was a xenobiologist by training even if she hadn't slept properly in 2 weeks, and the ship kept presenting her with things worth looking at. The way the bioluminescent channels dimmed and brightened in sequences that looked almost like breath. The Veth-Oru crew members who flowed past her on their 6 limbs, never quite touching her but always within a certain proximity, as if she were a foreign element they were still deciding the appropriate containment protocol for. She had just stopped to watch a Veth-Oru technician, smaller than HFY-4, membranes flickering rapid-fire blue, interface with what appeared to be a navigational system by pressing the upper manipulators flat against a surface and secreting something that the system absorbed and translated. She was thinking about the chemistry of it, the elegance of a nervous system that extended itself outward through secretion rather than code, when the communication array at the corridor's end played Lane's voice. "Thani, I've been thinking about the dark matter survey, and I think you're going to want to look at what I found in Section 7. Don't tell Dex I said this, but I think he was wrong about the density gradient." It was so precisely Lane, the slight formality, the buried delight, the small betrayal offered as intimacy, that Thani's body responded before her mind did. She turned toward the sound. She took 3 steps. She said, "Lane," into the air, and the word fell out of her with a rawness that embarrassed her immediately. The communication array cycled. Captain Voren's voice now. "All crew, this is a mandatory drill. Engineering team, I need you at stations in 10. Ashkani, you can stay where you are, I know you're mid-run. Then Dex, Murin, secondary cable first. Don't be an idiot about it." Then Lane again. "Thani, I've been thinking." She put her hand on the wall and held it there for a long time. HFY-4 had been following her. The Veth-Oru concept was something closer to asterisk accompanying with documentation intent, and watched the human's response to the audio archive with the focused attention of an archivist who has inadvertently introduced a new variable into an existing experiment. The archive was standard recovery protocol. When a vessel was lost, the Veth-Oru cataloged everything of potential informational value: navigation logs, atmospheric readings, biological samples, and acoustic records. The Crestfall *S communication logs had been extensive, crew of 4, apparently given to using voice channels for ordinary conversation rather than text, which was inefficient but not unusual for human vessels. The recordings had been imported, indexed, and placed in rotation as part of standard environmental archiving. The fact that the surviving crew member would have access to these recordings was not something SCIVRAC-4 had considered as a variable. The Veth-Oru did not preserve the voices of the dead. The dead secreted nothing. There was nothing to preserve. The human was speaking to the recordings now, not in distress or in distress of a different kind, a kind SCIVRAC-4 did not have a category for. She said, Lane, I looked at section 7. You were right about the density gradient. I was going to tell you, she said, I know Dex secondary cable first. I know. She said, I know Voron, I know you couldn't have gotten us out, I know. She was talking to recordings, to data, to sounds that had been separated from the bodies that made them and would never reconnect with those bodies. In the Veth-Oru collective memory, SCIVRAC-4 secreted a note that none of the others had framework for yet. The human is maintaining a relationship with an absence. This is not a malfunction. Observation suggests this is voluntary. Purpose unclear, but the behavior is. And here SCIVRAC-4 paused, because what came next was not a word that existed in Veth-Oru chemical language, which meant either that SCIVRAC-4 was failing to categorize correctly or that the category itself was absent. SCIVRAC-4 filed it as purpose, as yet untranslatable. Thani stopped talking eventually. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the tacky floor, knees drawn up, and the archive cycled through twice more. She stopped responding to it after the first cycle, but she did not leave. She sat in the corridor and let the voices fill the space around her and breathed. When SCIVRAC-4 approached slowly, at an angle that the human had demonstrated she found less threatening than direct approach, Thani looked up. How many recordings do you have? She asked. The translation implant she'd been given gave her a flat mechanical approximation, and SCIVRAC-4 received it as vibration through the floor and air combined. The membrane flickered in a pattern the translator rendered as 412 indexed vocal segments of an average duration of. Are you going to delete them? A long pause. The membrane went through several cycles. The translator offered. Standard recovery protocol involves. Are you going to delete them? Thani said again, and her voice was level in a way that was not calm. The pause this time was different. SCIVRAC-4 was consulting the collective memory, drawing on accumulated observations, looking for a framework in which this question and this tone could be understood as something other than a threat assessment. The framework did not exist yet. SCIVRAC-4 was going to have to build it from scratch, from data points that kept refusing to arrange themselves into anything familiar. The recordings are data asterisk. SCIVRAC-4's translator eventually produced. Data is preserved unless storage requires. Then don't, Thani said. Please just don't. And SCIVRAC-4, who did not have a category for what was being asked, did the thing that the Veth-Oru did when confronted with untranslatable data, recorded it precisely, flagged it as requiring continued study, and made no immediate determination. The Council of Elders convened in what Thani understood was an unusual location, not the dedicated deliberation chamber but the biological core of the ship, where the vessel's actual living systems were closest to the surface, where the walls were thinnest and most responsive. The elders arrived in sequence, their membranes carrying patterns she couldn't read, each of them pausing at the threshold to secrete something into the wall that absorbed it like soil-absorbing rain. They were exchanging information before the meeting formally began. The deliberation, in some sense, had already happened. What she was watching was the conclusion being made formal. There were 6 of them. Sivrak-4 was present at the margins, not an elder, present only because Sivrak-4 had filed the documentation that had prompted this meeting, and the elders had questions about the documentation's reliability that apparently required the source to be physically present. Thani had been told she had approximately 40 minutes of their processing cycle, which was not quite an hour, which was not much time in which to argue for something that a species without grief could not conceptually understand. She had spent the transit time considering arguments. She had philosophical frameworks. She had xenocultural precedent from the Shan-Arev Treaty Protocols on the preservation of artifacts belonging to the deceased. She had a reasonable position on information theory and the distinction between data that is redundant and data that is irreplaceable. She had notes. She set the notes aside. She crossed the room to the communication terminal, a flat secretion interface surface mounted at what the Veth-Oru seemed to consider eye level, which was approximately her sternum, and she pressed her palm to it, which did not work because she couldn't secrete anything through her palm, so she used the mechanical interface to the left of it, the one they had fitted for her use, and she pulled up the archive. She played them Voron's last recording. Not one of the ordinary ones, not the drill announcement, not the standard crew checks, the last one. The one that had come through 47 minutes before the crestfall broke apart, when the emergency had already made itself known, and Voron had put out the rescue coordinates on the salvage frequency in the precise, calm voice he'd been using for 30 years of crisis management. The voice that meant I have done everything possible and I am now accepting the outcome. And under that voice, barely audible, the ambient sounds of the ship coming apart. The creak of stressed hull, the hiss of atmosphere beginning to escape through a fracture, and in the background at the edge of audibility, Dex's voice saying something to Lane, and Lane's voice answering, and the two of them not arguing, which was unusual, which meant they already knew. 47 seconds, she played it once. The deliberation chamber went membrane silent. The Veth-Oru communicated in chemical pulse language, in the slow bioluminescent trade of compounds through shared air and permeable surface, and the collective lattice that held a crew's entire cognitive history. When they were fully engaged, the membranes were constantly active, a light show of rapid exchange, ideas and responses and counter-responses cycling through the group like current through water. The membranes were still. Sivrak-4 had not seen this before. In 11 years of recovery work and field documentation, Sivrak-4 had never seen a Veth-Oru deliberative council fall entirely silent. The Veth-Oru were a communicating species, the way some species were breathing species. It was involuntary, it was continuous. It stopped only when something had happened that the collective chemical language could not process. They were processing something it had no language for. 47 seconds of a dead man's voice in a failing ship, and 6 elders who had never experienced loss as humans understood it, who shed their dead efficiently, who carried no concept of a mind that kept its dead alive inside it, were confronting the evidence of a species that did. Thani did not say anything. She waited. She had learned in the last several days that the Veth-Oru interpreted speech during their silent processing intervals as an indication that the previous input had not been sufficient and more was required. She had nothing more. She had exactly what she had. The eldest's membrane moved first, slow, a color she hadn't seen it produce before, not the amber blue of ordinary exchange but something deeper, a violet-adjacent frequency at the margins of what her eyes could resolve. The translator, after a longer lag than usual, produced, "This is a record of a death." "Yes," Thani said. "You wish to preserve a record of a death." "I wish to preserve a record of the people who were alive until the death." The membrane processed this. The translator took a long time. "These are the same record." "Yes," she said, "that's exactly it." Another long stillness. Sivrak-4 at the margins, was secreting documentation notes in a continuous stream. Thani could see the membrane flickering rapidly, cataloging, the archivist in the room unable to stop archiving even in the middle of something that transcended archiving. The eldest's membrane shifted again. The translator produced. The Veth-Oru do not preserve the signals of those who have ceased. When a membrane ceases, it ceases. The chemical record dissipates. This is correct process. I know, Thani said. You believe the record should persist. I don't just believe it, I need it. She said it plainly, without performance, because there was no performance appropriate to this room and this species. I need to be able to hear them. I need to be able to say I was going to tell you and know that the you I'm talking to had real thoughts and specific opinions and a voice I can still learn from even now, even after. She paused. I know you don't do this. I know you don't need this. I'm asking you to preserve it because I am the last one who knew them, and without it they're just mass. They're just matter. They weren't matter. They were people. The translator could not find a word for what she had said. The eldest pulsed violet deep for a long time. Around the chamber the other elders had begun cycling, slowly, careful, the particular rhythm of a collective mind encountering a new coordinate and adjusting its internal map. Sivrak-4's membrane had gone still, which was the most unusual thing Thani had seen in days, which was saying something. Then Sivrak-4 moved, crossed the chamber past the elders, past protocol, and pressed manipulators to the communication interface and played the archive. Not Voron's last, the ordinary ones. Dex correcting Murin about the secondary cable. Lane's voice saying I've been thinking with that buried delight. Voron's drill announcement in his 30 years of crisis voice. The elders went still again. Sivrak-4's membrane pulsed once slowly. The translator rendered it imprecisely as, these are the shapes of minds that are gone. The shapes persist in the record. The human came from among these shapes and carries them internally. The record and the carried shapes are the same phenomenon. If the record dissipates, and here the translation produced something that no Veth-Oru phrase had previously contained, something that Sivrak-4 was constructing in real time from observed data and accumulated documentation. Then the shapes are lost twice. The eldest's membrane held the violet deep a long time. Then it shifted amber, steady, unhurried, and produced. The archive will not be deleted. Thani put her hand against the wall and held it there, not because the wall was communicative but because she needed to hold something. The wall, obligingly, gave slightly under her palm. Sivrak-4 watched her. The archivist had one more note to secrete into the collective memory. The last observation of the incident log. The one that would take the longest to translate because there was no existing chemical language structure for it. The human carries its dead inside itself. This is not a malfunction. This is not inefficiency. The dead continue to act within the living human shaping choices, providing what the translator can only approximate as instruction, comfort, witness. The human went into a Veth-Oru deliberation chamber with nothing except the voices of people who were no longer alive, and the voices were enough. The voices were, in fact, the argument. We do not have a word for this. We will need one. The recovery vessel continued its deceleration. In the corridor outside the biological core, the communication array cycled through its archive, Dex's voice, Lane's voice, Voron's voice, the ordinary traffic of a crew that had been alive and specific and known to each other. And Sivrak-4's membrane pulsed once slowly, holding the new color at the edges. Violet at the margins, unhurried, the Veth-Oru approximation of a silence that meant something, held the way a human holds a breath before speaking, and did not translate it, because some things, Sivrak-4 was beginning to understand, are not meant to be filed.